Hey, Les, welcome to the show. Would you please give our audience a little bit on your background?
Well, thank you. Obviously, it's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Les Rosen. I am an attorney at law, but don't hold that against me. After all, as the old joke goes, only 95% of all attorneys give the rest of us a bad name. But I actually left the law in 1997 or so and entered the world of pre-employment background screening and due diligence and hiring. Before that, I was a criminal lawyer, which some people consider to be an oxymoron. And in the world of background screening, I have been doing that since about 97 or 98. And I have written on it extensively. I have written a couple of books that are guaranteed to put you to sleep, 800 plus pages with more than most people would care to know about. I have lectured all over the country, managed to hopefully entertain audiences at national and state, regional HR conferences and due diligence conferences. I serve as an expert witness, and our firm, Employment Screening Resources, is a national pre-employment background firm, and we have the privilege and honor of working with employers all over the United States, large and small, in their hiring process to help them to, as you put it, hire the best.
Yeah, so, and you have been a partner of ours for easily 10 years, maybe all of our 14-year existence. I think actually it has been all of our 14 years. You guys were one of the early pioneers in having an online system for doing background checks, weren't you?
We were, and obviously it's been a privilege and an honor to work with you guys, and certainly appreciate all your work. And we were one of the pioneers. I can't say exactly who was the first to be online. Some other firms came online around the same time we did. But yeah, we started in the days when everything was done with fax machines, and then background screening progressed to where the employer entered the information online. And now jumping ahead to 2020, the state of the art is that an applicant receives an email, and then the applicant self-enters their own information, and the process starts that way. So there's been a lot of technological leaps in the world of background screening, and with the onset of artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data, who knows what the future holds? But it's been an interesting ride.
So Les, I'm kind of curious since, in our upcoming trainings, our book and that type of thing, we have, a full chapter on you guys and what you do because it's so fascinating. I actually advise my clients, you cannot hire anyone without doing a background check before their first day on the job. You can do it after you make an offer, but subject to the background check. But can you talk a little bit about that, about the importance of a background check, or, if you disagree with me, I would find that hard to believe, but.
Well, no, absolutely. And as you point out in Hire the Best, the cost of a bad hire is astronomical. If you should hire the employee from hell, it's a huge financial and legal nightmare. So there's just any number of reasons why you want to make sure every hire is going to work out and is not going to come back and be a source of trouble, legal drama and trauma for you. So the thing about the background check in terms of the entire employment process is that it really comes at the very end of the process. There's all sorts of processes, as you point out, and Hire the Best to make sure you're hiring the best, and phone interviews and assessment tools. And there's all sorts of ways to make sure you have a good hire. Where our industry comes in, our business comes in, is that after using all those processes and procedures you point out and Hire the Best, you arrive at your candidate. You now want to make sure there is no reason not to hire the person. So we don't tell you who to hire. We can't advise you on the best fit and so forth. But we're the ones that say, wait a minute, before you make this final, let's make sure that the person has the education they claim. Let's make sure they actually worked where they said they worked. Let's make sure they don't have any sort of disqualifying criminal record. I use the word disqualifying because the use of criminal records is highly regulated. And so that's our part in the process. It's the icing on the cake. It's the last piece of due diligence that an employer needs to go through before the person comes on board. And it could be at the time the offer is made. In California, it's now done after there's been an offer letter because of a fair chance hiring law. But it's at or after the offer is the rule, depending upon the state law.
Now, we have always recommended our clients to ask 3 times during the interview process. So at the phone screen, during their first in-person interview, and at the time of the offer. And it's kind of an ask statement. It's by the way, we do a background check on all our candidates. Is there anything that might turn up that you'd like to make us aware of? And we found that works pretty good. One of our clients actually had a young gal say, no, there's nothing. And then he got it back. She had a warrant out for her arrest by the police department. And, you know, he's a super nice guy. So he didn't just write her off because she was a good candidate, but he actually called her and said, hey, you know, we did the background check. You said there wouldn't be anything, but this is what's on there. And she goes, oh, I'm so sorry. I was at a party. I'd had a little bit to drink. I was belligerent to a police officer, and I totally forgot about that. I will go resolve that right now. And she actually did, came back, had another interview, and they decided to hire her. And she was a great employee for about a year, you know?
Yeah. Well, that story has a lot of things to unravel. I mean, there's a lot of interesting points just in that one story. So first of all, that's a great question to ask. We do recommend it. Some employers now modify that question slightly in view of ban the box and fair chance hiring because there's the second chance movement. But we do still suggest telling applicants we do background checks. Is there anything you're concerned about? We also suggest telling applicants we check past employers. Is there anything you're concerned about? Because past employment checks can be just as valuable as criminal checks. And it also underscores very nicely that story that a criminal record cannot legally and as a practical matter should not be used to automatically disqualify someone from a job. It should not be an early knockout punch. And we can talk a little bit more about the second chance movement and ban the box and fair chance hiring. But there's a lot of people with minor criminal records. Sometimes people just forget. We say it all the time. Sometimes people are notoriously poor self-historians. They just frankly don't remember, or maybe she thought it was a traffic ticket. So you have to be careful in terms of pigeonholing or categorizing people. And like the story you just told, it turned out to be a great hire. It would have been a shame to have lost that candidate after all the time and effort because of a criminal matter that perhaps was not related to the job.
Well, in your opinion, is there ever something on the criminal record that's like, no, we can't hire this person?
Oh yeah, definitely, and that comes up. I'm an expert witness in a number of cases, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission basically has a test. We talk about discrimination and the use of criminal records, and if a criminal record comes up that's directly job related or presents a very clear risk, you don't want that person. Now, the obvious example, this is extreme, but for demonstration purposes, you wouldn't want a person convicted of sexual offense, child molestation, rape, assault, and so forth, to have access to children. Well, that's a no-brainer. But short of that, I mean, if a person has in the past committed theft crimes, well, maybe they're not a great fit to be handling your cash. If a person, it depends on the crime. And so the EEOC tells us that when you do have a criminal matter, you take a look at the nature and gravity of the crime, the nature of the job, the age of the crime, and there's a process that we advise clients on how to use a criminal offense fairly. So you don't automatically react in a knee-jerk reaction to a criminal offense. But on the other hand, there are lots of cases we've seen where people had criminal offenses that were just too close and too sensitive to the job, where it presented an undue risk. And so the employer made a decision, we can't have that person. At the end of the day, it's case by case. And what the law really says now, the trend, is that everyone's entitled to an individualized assessment. You can't just respond to the fact that there's a crime. You have to take a look at, you have to lift the hood and find out about the person and the job and the details.
So let's say you had somebody who came in and interviewed for a major political party or a candidate for a major political party, and they are a stellar candidate in every regard, but they have something on their criminal record that they were arrested as a protester at one of that political party's gatherings. Other than that, I mean, they're a stellar candidate and they've answered all the questions well. Can that political party or that, you know, whatever, turn them down because that event, that situation?
Well, they'd be hard pressed to. So again, you go back to basics, and a lot of what we do is all about procedure and process. The employer has to make the final decision, but as with a lot of things related to human resources, as long as you have a fair procedure and process, and it's objective and reasonable, and it's not arbitrary and capricious, you can justify the decision. And in the case you just said, I would think that the political party would have a hard time turning the person down because they were hyper zealous in terms of one of their political events. Now, if the person had a theft crime, an embezzlement, an assault, something, some sort of sex offense, that'd be something different. So you have to take it, you look at it one by one and do an individualized assessment. But I think the trend, or the pendulum is now swinging in favor of the employee. And as a practical matter, the employer has to articulate a pretty darn good reason why there's a nexus, a connection between the crime and the job before turning the person down.
So what's the risk? So let's say whatever the situation, let's stay with that situation just because we've already talked about it. Let's say they turn the person down and there was nothing else that came up in the interview that they can point to honestly that was a negative. What's their risk potential? I mean, what if the candidate wanted to make an issue out of it? What could they do? What's the financial risk? Whatever.
Well, potentially, and you don't see it that often, but potentially the candidate could file a complaint with either the State Civil Rights Board or the EEOC. If they don't take action or investigate, they can request a right to sue letter and sue on the basis of discrimination, on the basis that that the use of the criminal records was unfair and created a disparate impact. But if the employer, again, it goes back to procedure and process. So if the employer fairly and objectively gave the applicant, he or she, a fair chance, they followed they went through an analysis. They gave the person all of their rights. The person had an individualized assessment, and they just came to the honest conclusion that the history was fundamentally inconsistent with the job. Well, they probably have some defenses. So a lot of it, you have to do it right and make sure the processes are fair. And reasonable minds could differ. So if as long as they come to a reasonable conclusion, it's rational, they might be able to justify it. On the surface of it, most employers don't have the option of hiring from a pool of only perfect candidates. And so if your candidate pool is limited to just perfect people, you're gonna have a pretty hard time finding candidates. So we all come with some imperfections. So there's got to be a certain amount of willingness on the part of an employer to really look at what the person can really do. I mean, can they do what you want? Are they qualified? Are they dedicated? All the things you point out and hire the best. Do they fit all those qualifications? And some sort of one-time aberration, should not be held against them too much, unless you're just convinced in good faith that it's a deal breaker for some reason.
I'm kind of curious. One of the things that's really muddied the waters lately in regards to drug testing is the legalization of marijuana in certain states. I mean, so how does that really work? I mean, is that kind of made drug testing not worth the effort, or there's so many other drugs it's still worth the effort? What do you do with marijuana? I mean, literally, I had one of my clients the other day had a situation where one of their managers was not feeling very well, and the manager noticed an employee that was kind of putting some oil on the wrist and on the hands and that type of thing. And the manager said, "Oh, is that some of that essentials oils? Oh, I could really use that. I'm not feeling very well." Put it on her, and then about 30 minutes later, the manager was, "Whoa." And the employee then admitted,
looking for donuts to eat.
Yeah. So the manager was then saying, "Whoa," and then the employee admitted, "I'm sorry, that was marijuana." Well, then the employee was using. I mean, you can get it in gummy bears. You can do all that. What do you do now? You can't. It's not necessarily smoking. They're eating it.
Well, that's a complicated, evolving area. And so at that point, if an employer is concerned, I think we are at the point now where marijuana has gotten so socially accepted that unless a person is obviously impaired under the influence, I think employers are a little less concerned. And if you want to hire only people who don't use any type of marijuana, again, you're limiting your employment pool. So, the basic problem is that there's numerous states, California, a whole lot of other states have legalized it, first for medicinal reasons and now for general recreational reasons. And then you still have a Schedule I federal drug. So under the federal law, it's illegal. Under state law, it's legal. The few cases that have tested that, there's been some mixed results. We happen to be in California, where the courts said, well, the federal law still rules. There's other courts have gone differently. So it's an evolving area. I think at the end of the day, you go back to basics. Is the employee impaired? Are they not doing their job, unable to do the job? You're really looking at performance. I mean, there's certain drugs that are prohibited per se. Heroin, morphine, marijuana, certain things that are just bad to have. But marijuana is in a transition period. So the first thing I would tell an employer to do is don't do anything and evaluate whether you're really concerned. And in the scenario you just gave, giving someone marijuana without telling them is separately and in and of itself bad judgment. Because then you're giving something to somebody. And so there's that element. There's, these in human resources, there's always layers to look at. But as a general proposition, if an applicant is using marijuana, but it's not impacting them at work, they're not impaired, they're doing their job, they're just fine. I think most employers are not looking at that too harshly, unless there's a bona fide occupational qualification. Maybe you're working in a drug rehab center or something. I don't know. So then you may want to be more careful.
Well, and it seems like this puts a heavier burden on employers to really get their business organized. So the metrics around performance and how that information is gathered and tracked is accurate, clear, measurable, specific type of thing. Because otherwise you got nothing to go on, if I'm hearing you correctly.
No, absolutely true. And a lot of times in background screening, it goes back to the basics. It goes back to having a well-written job description with the hard skills and soft skills. It goes back to having, the old mantra that that there's numbers or metrics for everybody. You need to be able to judge performance. And oftentimes when you're involved in the background screening, those are the things you're concerned about, because oftentimes those questions about what is something that should eliminate you or not goes back to the job description. Or if something happens like marijuana use at the job, it's exactly as you say, it goes to metrics. If the person's job performance has not changed at all, they're meeting their quota or exceeding, it's harder to make a case. So as far as marijuana is concerned, I think we just all need to stand by until the laws are a little clearer on that. But at this point, I think most employers are happy to have hardworking, well-performing employees. And if the metrics are there and they're doing the job right, then it's not as big a concern, potentially.
So what's the process that, I'm kind of curious of a story that you may have of someone who lied on their educational background. But I'm also curious about we're talking to a lot of entrepreneurs on this show. And sometimes, they're making a gut feel. They meet with someone and they're interested. They think the person's a good fit. And the person lists a Stanford MBA, or they're listing whatever, and they're thinking, oh, this is just great. And I'm curious, maybe an incident you might recall where, everything kind of lined up. They made the hire, but when they did the background check, it turned out that educational qualification, I just mentioned Stanford MBA, it could be anything, turned out to be false. And I'm curious not only of a story you might have there, but also what's the process you guys follow versus what somebody might do on their own?
Well, so let me unravel that. There's three layers there. The first thing that's really interesting, we see this all the time, is that when we do a background check, the employer is hoping we don't find anything. The employer is paying us money because they've decided, using whatever process is, that this is their person. They want it to go smoothly. They're invested. They made the decision. This is our person. And they're not particularly happy if something comes back that's derogatory or negative, because what that means is they fell for it. Their gut instinct gave them the wrong story. The halo effect kicked in. They made the hire, and I think, as you quoted in Hire the Best, there's that statistic that the hiring decision is made in 4.3 seconds or something. That means someone just fell hook, line, sinker for someone who's not being truthful. And there's actually some scientific studies that indicate that human beings, just by the way we're wired, that we're not nearly as good as we think we are at telling who's lying or telling the truth at face-to-face conversations. There's these studies done at the University of California, San Francisco, where essentially on the ability of human beings to detect who's lying or not lying. And basically it's a flip of a coin. There's a few people that are human lie detector machines, but for most of the population, you cannot tell in an interview or by talking to somebody if someone's lying or not. And sometimes you get into problems by not following your gut instincts. Sometimes you have the gut instinct that, well, there is something wrong here, but you suppress it because of the halo effect, and you offer the job. So it works both ways. So, trust but verify is the right answer. Education is real interesting. Want to just talk about that for a minute?
Yeah.
So yeah, we see that all the time, and it's amazing how much education fraud goes on. I think a lot of applicants want to give themselves an educational promotion the easy way. Now, for those of us that earned an advanced degree and did it the hard way, bought books, spent time listening to professors, taking tests, looking for parking spaces. I went to UCLA. It took 5 years to get a 4-year degree. It took a year to park. For those of us who did it that way, there's a term for that. It's called a dinosaur. These days, you want a college degree, all you need is a computer, a printer, and a credit card, and you can get a real degree from any one of 10,000 fake schools around the world, or a fake degree from any real school. And as an interesting exercise, you can go on LinkedIn, put in your favorite fake school. Well, or you can find a fake school on a search engine. And when you do a LinkedIn advanced search feature and put in that fake school, people's jaws usually drop when they see the number of people claiming degrees from degree mills that are absolutely worthless. They come from fake institutions who have, by the way, then created their own accreditation bodies as well. So it's a scam. It's $1 million scam.
Yeah, I did that actually as part of the book, part of the work we did in that training, based on your recommendation. It was like, whoa, you gotta be kidding me.
I mean, page after page of people with worthless degrees. Or the other thing is that a person, and there are legitimate schools that are distance learning or, offsite learning that are legitimate and accredited. So I don't want to, be too critical of all schools. But there's also websites where you can buy degrees where you could. My dog has a degree from the University of Arizona, an advanced degree. All the more impressive. My dog had been dead for 10 years when she got the degree, and transcripts as well. Only got a B in physical education, which was surprising. But so there's all sorts of ways to fake degrees. And sometimes what people do is they'll be a few credits short, so they'll award themselves the degree they never quite got. So degree fraud it runs rampant. There's, we're living in the era of what you almost call degree gate. And you just can't assume that a person has a degree anymore. Just because it's on LinkedIn doesn't mean it's so. So basically, you can call the school. A background firm like ours will typically work through something called the National Student Clearinghouse, which is an organization put together by the registrars of most schools in the country. And there's also a list of accredited schools. If you need to find out whether it's a real school or not, you can go to the Council of Higher Education Accreditation, or called CHIA, and they're the folks that they accredit the accreditors. And the U.S. Department of Education has a website too. Anyone who gets federal money, there's a website that will tell you if the school's legit. So there's also channels to do it. Most employers, however, just outsource it, leave it to a background firm. For the few bucks we charge it, we do it in mass every day, but in high numbers. And so it's just easier to have us do it, and then to return the information. But you just can't take things at face value. And most people are honest and straightforward, and usually it checks out. But we have this wall of I think we took it down a few years ago. We just had a whole wall that was plastered full of fake degrees. And sometimes we'd get the fake, we'd come back and we'd report someone as not having a degree. The applicant would then say, I do have a degree, and produce a copy of it. And what they produce a copy of was a fake degree you can buy online. We would send it to a registrar who was a little puzzled and said, well, where did this come from? This has our name on it. It looks like our degree, but none of the deans exist, and that's not our seal. So how did this happen? And then that goes up on our wall of shame. So education discrepancies and employment discrepancies are two of the biggest areas where applicants have been known to fudge a bit, and where employers are most at risk of being fooled.
How far do you go back in your employment confirmations? I mean, because if you're hiring somebody right out of college, that's not a big deal. But if you're hiring somebody who's 50 or 60 like me, then that you could go back 15 different firms or something like that.
No, it's a bit of a rule of reason, and typically employers want to know what you've been doing the past 7 years. And in background screening, and in the Bible, coincidentally, 7 years is kind of that magic number, the 7 years, the sabbatical. There's some previous legislation. California has a 7-year rule when it comes to criminal records. The Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA, has 7 years built into it. So the 7-year rule has kind of emerged. So we kind of go back and, sometimes an employer will say the last 3 employers, or they might say go back 7 years. It's a rule of reason. Every employer has their own. But you're right, everyone's different. You may have a person who worked just at one place for 10 years. Or if you're just out of college, you may have worked at Taco Bell and McDonald's. They never return our calls. So it's a bit of a rule of reason. It depends on the risk involved with the job and how long they've been out and so forth. So each employer has to decide that protocol. So we have lots of clients, and they all we discuss with them protocols, and they pick a protocol that seems appropriate to the nature of the type of job.
So I'm curious about 2 things. One is, a lot of people in our clients, we serve a lot of people that are IT managed service providers, but we also serve restaurants, manufacturers, a lot of others. But I'm kind of curious of 2 areas in this tight job market. One is when I'm hiring a contractor, an individual, okay? And the other is when I'm working with a temp agency. And what risks are there with those type of people? Should we be doing a background check there? What are your thoughts there?
Well, so the question is, we're doing a background check, and this may sound self-serving because obviously we provide that service, but from looking at the litigation and the exposure, the answer is, yeah, you should do a background check because relatively speaking, is cheap as heck compared to the cost of just one bad hire. But the real question is, well, how far of a background check? One size doesn't fit all. So it's all risk-based. So if you're hiring an entry-level employee, do you really need to do as much work as you would do with a VP? No, of course not. Although basic human resource doctrine tells us that all VPs should be screened in the same way as all entry-level people. So independent contractors and staffing agencies present a couple of unique issues. So starting with the staffing agency, you just need to be careful as to what it is a staffing agency actually does. We once had a situation where a client had a person that they hired from a staffing agency, worked there for 6 months. The client decided, well, we're going to go from temp to perm. So they have him on a temporary basis, make him a permanent offer. The client redid the background check thinking, well, the guy got background once, it was fine. We did the background check, came up with some pretty horrendous information that really made the person probably unsuitable for that job. And the employer said, well, what happened? We had the staffing firm do a background check, and the employer went back to the staffing firm and said to the staffing firm, how did this person get through? He doesn't meet our requirements. And the staffing firm said, well, you told us to do a background check, but you never told us to read it. So you have to, or there's cases where the staffing firm says we only hire the best and we screen carefully. Well, when a staffing firm says we screen carefully, what they generally mean is that we're screening the resume for fit. We use the word screen to mean background screen. So if you're working with a temp agency, you have to make sure you understand, are they doing background checks? You can't assume it. If they are doing background checks, are they doing it with an accredited or a legitimate background agency? If there is a quote unquote hit, a discrepancy or something potentially negative, who's looking at it? What's the criteria? Where's it going? So a lot of that has to be answered up front. You just can't go out to a staffing agency who tells you, well, we give you the best and assume that they're doing a real background check. Independent contractors are a little more difficult because by definition, the job history is spotty. They actually have a project history, not really a job history. So that's always a problem that it's hard to tell. So the employer has to really figure out how do they judge this person's past work, their competency, what type of assessments you're going to use. And at the same time, you can check education. You can make sure the person doesn't have any sort of untoward criminal record. So there's no one rule. It's not one size fits all. It's a rule of reason according to the employers and basically what risks they're facing with that hire.
One thing that strikes me too, and I do say this a little bit tongue in cheek because I've worked independently the last 14 years. I've got a team of, a couple people that work with me. But when you're talking about solo people, independent contractors, or you're talking about people in a temp environment, sometimes they're very stable, and they're in that as either as an interim thing in the temp, or they're solo for a contractor because they just prefer to do their own thing. However, I know from my hiring experience, and share, if I'm wrong on your end, your experience, a lot of times when you're interviewing someone who's been a contractor, an independent contractor, there's a reason they're an independent contractor. They in some ways can't work with other people or in a highly structured environment.
Right. Well, in other words, they don't play well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They don't play well with others.
Yeah.
Well, and hopefully that comes out during the hiring process. So if a person has a 5 or 10 year history of working from home, setting their own hours, they go to the office by leaving the bedroom and going into the den. You really got to question that if you're hiring to bring them in house on a 9 to 5 job. I mean, it's fundamentally incompatible. And that sort of preference would be hard to pick up at a background check. I mean, we can only call past employers or names that are given to us. So that goes to the ability to hire the best in terms of really understanding, is this person a fit? Because someone used to working in their pajamas, they're not going to change and get suited up and come in every day. But it becomes hard. So and sometimes you just check what you can check. So if a person has been working in assignments for 5 years, there's really no way for us to call their past assignments. That's really up to the hiring company to do. We can check their degree. We can check other things, driver's license, driving check, criminal record, and so forth. But with an independent contractor, if you're hiring them not to be an independent contractor as an employee, it's hard to check. Now, if you're hiring them to do an independent job for you, then you might have ways of, checking with past clients as to the quality of their work. And some of these freelance sites have a feedback loop that you can get some information on. So sometimes,
go ahead. So I'm curious, because I recommend something and occasionally it comes back where somebody who has a different background check company than you guys will say, oh no, you can't check for that, or you shouldn't check for that, or it has no value. I always recommend to my clients that they do not only, there's a number of things I want you to check, but one of the things I do is I say, not only on the criminal court side, but you want to check the civil court. And the reason I do that is and my understanding is, and by the way, I make it clear, I don't give legal advice. And I say, in your state, you may not be able to make a decision based on this, but I do know someone who did not do a civil court check. And there were 4 or 5 lawsuits against the person that this guy hired. And if he'd known about that, he would have saved about $1.5 million.
Wow.
And so, I say to him, if they're suing their former employer, or the former employer is suing them, or they're suing their neighbor, or the neighbor is suing them, or whatever, maybe you can't make a hiring decision based on it. But wouldn't you like to know? So that's why I say it's worth the few additional dollars. It's not much to check at least I recommend the county they reside in and the biggest county nearby. So I threw a lot at you there, Les, but what do you think? Am I doing the wrong thing, or?
Well, no, let me unravel that a little bit. So the first thing to keep in mind is that civil record checks are inherently a lot more complicated than criminal checks, and really for a couple of reasons. Number one, a criminal check occurs in the county where the crime was committed. In a civil suit, it could be in a number of locations where the past employer was located, where some harm occurred, where someone's incorporated. So it's hard to locate the right place. And also in civil cases, it's sometimes hard to know who the party is. You don't really have a lot of identification in the file. You don't really have a date of birth or a driver's license or a partial social. You have to read the complaint to figure out whether it's your person. So it's inherently challenging, and it is somewhat of a low return search. And firms can certainly do it. But with everything, it's you make a calculation. Now, in the case you just described, person lost $1.5 million, spending another 20 or 20, 30 or whatever it would be for a civil check. In that case, it would have been great.
Yeah. And I know our clients have been really pleased with you guys doing it. And I know there's been a few of them that things have cropped up.
Yeah.
Where they've seen some things they would not have seen otherwise.
Yeah. So just keep in mind that civil checks are an area where you really got to be careful. There's not the type of databasing. There's problems with identification with names, where to search, whether it's even relevant to employment or not. It could have been, neighbors suing about a fence. I mean, all sorts of stuff can pop out. So again, like everything in life, it ends up being cost benefit. There's a cost to doing it versus the benefit. It's like buying insurance. Some people never pay for it. one bad event you sure wish you had, right? So,
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I have a Prius, and somebody, some guy stole my catalytic converter
Oh
about 2
boy.
months ago. So
Oh no.
and the guy who replaced it said he saw a video on YouTube that they can do it in 30 seconds.
Right.
They have like a, what is it? It's a chain pipe cutter. They just loop it over there, snap the cords, and they're gone.
Gone in 30
And
seconds.
yeah,
All
yeah. And
right.
I was so thankful that I had comprehensive on the car,
Right.
because that was a $1,600 repair.
So you know, in business, we make these cost benefit decisions all the time, and sometimes
Yeah.
you say, well, let's, I don't want to, let me save a few bucks and don't do the check. And if that check would have saved you a bad hire and lost customers and the legal and financial nightmare and the dislocation of whatever that person did, then you go, well, that wasn't the right decision.
It's
So,
kind of Murphy's Law, right? It's Murphy's Law. If you do it, you may not need it. If you don't do it, then, oh, if I'd done that.
yeah, exactly. What am I spending this extra money for? But
Yeah.
fortunately, background checks, compared to the whole process, is probably the least expensive part of the hiring process. Maybe I can't give any real numbers because everyone's different. But generally speaking, the cost of a background check is less than a person's first day salary. And if it turns out,
Easily.
yeah, easily. One time I calculated, this was years ago, that our standard background check and the standard wage, we were saying by 2:00 on their first day on the job, you've already paid them more than the background check. And anyone who runs a business knows that the surest path to disaster is not having the right people doing the right thing. Yeah. And so so the cost of that service, and again, it sounds self-service as we provide it, but I think that's why so many employers do it now. It's become a bit of a non-brainer. And God forbid if you happen to hire someone and they hurt somebody and it turns out a background check would have revealed that they had a propensity towards violence. I mean, you're stuck with a negligent hiring lawsuit. Maybe you have insurance, hopefully. If you're hit for punitive damages, insurance doesn't cover that. Not to mention the fallout and the bad publicity and the lost customers. So,
oh, well, even more than that. I mean, living with that.
Yeah.
I mean, and yeah, we're doing a needle in a haystack type of thing. It shouldn't be something that comes up often, but I just wouldn't want to live with that type of memory that, if I'd done a background check, it could have happened. And by the way, I don't want to end on that note. So what have we not covered that we should have covered when you've lived in this space, this space, you're one of the top people in the country. Les, I'm so glad to have you on the show. What is, any last piece of advice that you want to give people in the area of background checks? I know you mentioned one thing pre-show. There are some free things that people can do. Quite frankly, when I've looked at those myself, I've found they're very limited as far as their scope and time consuming. But I mean, what advice do you have for our audience?
Well, the free things I'm referring to is not do-it-yourself background check sites. I mean, we all get spam every day, and half my spam seems to be find out anything on anyone for $9.95. And if you believe that, I have a bridge I'll sell you that some people call the Brooklyn Bridge. It's the Rosen Bridge. I own it. I'll sell it to you. So you don't want to become a background screening agency, just like you don't write your own software or clean your own windows. That's why you outsource things that aren't essential to your main business. But there are free things you can do as an employer that's built into the process. And we've mentioned a couple of them: having a well-written job description, having ways to measure performance and so forth. Something as simple as making sure that the person's work history makes sense. Calling past employers. I tell employers that the biggest bang for the buck, and in many cases, I don't want to bore you with a lot of stories, but there's many cases where just calling a past employer was really the key to discovering who the problem was. There was a case where I was an expert witness some years ago where a carpet cleaning company sent a fellow into a woman's home. She was happened to be a beloved community homemaker and a pediatric physician, a wonderful person. This carpet cleaner did a job. There was some discussion about the quality of the job, and the carpet cleaner resolved the dispute by the cold-blooded strangulation murder of the homemaker. And that's not a great way to end the session either. But when the dust cleared, what happened was that he did have a criminal record. In fact, he had just got out of prison for doing 16 years for armed robbery. But because of the nature of criminal records, the age, the location, the type of crime, the fact it was federal, for technical reasons at the time, would not necessarily come up in a background check. What would have come up, however, is if the employer had called the 3 references, they would have found that 2 of the companies didn't exist, and the one company that did exist never heard of the guy. So the best thing you can do as an employer is not only read the application carefully and ask questions about it, look for employment gaps, but call past employers. And sometimes we assume, well, because a past employer won't really tell us anything, there's no value to it. The opposite is true. It's extremely valuable to call past employers, because even if all you do is confirm the veracity of name and the employer, start date, end date, and job title, you can't really ask for salary anymore because they're under salary secrecy laws. It is a huge amount of protection and due diligence, and that doesn't cost much of anything. Reviewing the resume carefully to look for employment gaps or things that don't make sense takes a minute or two. Doesn't cost you anything, and so hopefully our clients are doing those sort of things. So we don't. It doesn't even get to the point of an offer being made, because those people are filtered out ahead of time. The other thing I'd recommend for employers of any size.
So let me, before you go on to that, let me pick up on something. So we do the same thing. So we teach people how to do what we call an employee strategic plan. So it's like a business plan for their success, like job description on steroids. We also, we encourage them to call every employer and to confirm that things are good there, that the information lines up. We teach them how to, ask certain questions so they can get some answers. We also have a list of, I don't know, 14 or so items.
Right.
We encourage them to look at on the resume. But gosh, and I was just reiterating that, and I forgot the question I was going to ask you. But so go on, and then when it comes back to me, I'll ask it.
Well, another thing you can do that doesn't cost much is just the fact you do background checks might discourage somebody who doesn't want to be open and honest. And that goes back to an earlier discussion that you tell people we do background checks. And the idea is great. It encourages people to be self-disclosing. And if they don't want their background check, they can go down the block to an employer who's not so careful and let them become the employer of choice for problem employees. So, So those are 3 of the things that you can do.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you was, one thing we recommend to our clients is we recommend a very thorough but relatively quick hiring process. But what we say, and it sounds like you're in agreement, is we suggest, you don't have to wait until after the offer to check with references, because it might save you time by checking the references after the first interview, where you think you're interested in them. Check the references. That way, if there's a problem, you just saved yourself some time.
Absolutely. A formal background check involving criminal records is regulated by many states, but checking references, to my knowledge, is not. And so if you have someone where you're on the cusp of making an offer, you think you're interested, picking up the phone, making 2 or 3 calls, as I said, if all you get is start date, end date, and job title, that's significant. Because that at least verifies. And some employers will actually tell you something about the person. Some won't, but many will. A surprising number will, more than you think maybe. And so that's absolutely great advice. But anyone who hires anyone without calling the references, that's just a walking definition of negligent hiring. Now, background checks will call employers as well, but keep in mind the background check occurs after the offer. And the people who are doing the calling, they don't know the job description. They don't know what you're looking for. It's just a Joe Friday deal, just the facts, start date, end date, job title. Absolutely incumbent upon anyone who's hiring for someone, either HR or the hiring manager, to make that call. That's probably the most important walkaway point. Don't ever hire anyone without making an attempt to call the past employers.
Makes sense.
A lot of information.
Yeah, and you said for 7 years at least. And then one question for you is, we typically recommend that, they do a phone screen. Of course, they get a resume, they match it up, they look at that, they look online, do a search, a few things, and then they're going to do a phone interview, phone screen. When the person comes in for their first interview, we recommend that they have them complete a job application, and that job application should have permission to do a background check at the appropriate time, and also to do any reference checks and whatever else. Is that consistent with what you guys teach?
Oh, absolutely. Everything needs to be done with consent. Privacy is now a big deal. California just passed a brand new privacy law The rest of the nation will probably follow. Massachusetts already has one. So consent cures a lot of ills. And we never do anything. And now, the background check, we're governed by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which has extensive procedures and processes and requirements. And consent and disclosure is the mainstay of that. But just doing what you're suggesting, absolutely don't do anything without consent. We even recommend don't go looking online until you get consent. There's a lot of problems, people going on the internet. We think that's an area of potential danger for employers, because you might see things that later on you could be accused of acting in a discriminatory fashion. There's this TMI, too much information online. So it's a little bit of an area. Obviously, if you're recruiting and using those tools, you can't get consent. But as just as a safety valve, we're seeing more employers even wait to get consent before they go online even. And that might be something to consider. But absolutely, consent is golden.
It's so bizarre. I mean, you think about that. It's like if something is online about somebody, it's public information.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't you be able to consider it? And quite frankly, I've even got an issue a little bit with, that you can't ask for what their compensation was at their prior employer. All we're doing is encouraging people who might have a tendency to lie or embellish,
right,
to do so. I mean, why can't you just ask me? It's all above board. It's like, hey, can't we all be honest here? Can't we all play fair? Because otherwise, now we say, well, what are your compensation needs? And maybe they were making 30,000. They're like, well, my compensation needs are 65. 65,000. Like, what you're telling me I almost can't do anything. Anyway, anything you want to close with, Les? I know you've got to jump to some other stuff. I'm so glad you came on. This has been
no, I'm happy to. The only thing I would suggest to any listeners, that if you do background checks, you do want to make sure that the background screening firm has been accredited by, it used to be called the National Association of Professional Background Screening. Now it's called Professional Background Screening Association. I was the founder and the first co-chair, and they set accreditation standards. And it's important to look at that, because without boring your listeners, when you lift up the hood of background screening, it's incredibly arcane, Byzantine, and difficult. I'm a lawyer. I've been doing this for a long time. Weekly, something comes up that I've never seen before or never thought about before. So it's inordinately complicated. Now, most employers, particularly their small, medium, or emerging business, they don't want to deal with the complications. To them, it's just a black box. Just make it happen. And so it's very important to work with a firm that makes it happen legally, because there are so many lawsuits on violations of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There are so many ways to break the law. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So with background screening, the mantra is you got to do it, but you got to do it right. And so it's now really become more of a legal compliance service than anything else, in the sense of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. There's salary secrecy laws. There's ban the box laws, fair chance hiring laws. When can you ask what? How can you use it? What do you do if you find a criminal hit?
There's too many laws.
Well,
there's too many laws. Now, do you still have everybody in your organization? You still have everybody in the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. There's some firms that are essentially, they do everything in India. We've always, from the very beginning, in fact, I got a law passed in California, first in the nation, where if a background checking firm does anything offshore, they got to tell you. And there are a lot of background firms that are basically, the only thing they do onshore is they count their money and they have their salespeople. And for some firms that work out fine. Maybe for a multinational firm, they don't care. But it is a good thing to ask if they're sending things to Manila or Bangalore or Mumbai. But our opinion is it's so complicated that everything needs to be done in the U.S., where you can control it, and you can also have a SOC 2 privacy seal and control the privacy aspect of things. So yeah, we're a big proponent of doing things onshore. And I'm not saying that firms that do it differently, that there's anything wrong with them. It's just not our choice. So employers need to take a look and decide what works out best for them.
Well, and the problem is, once again, I'm going to a background firm to eliminate risk, and that just sounds like a risk to me. But as you say, I don't know all those firms. I can't comment on them. But Les, I just want to thank you so much for being on the show. It's great. How can people reach you if they have any questions? I know we have some information on your service on our website, Manage to Win. But what about if they want to reach you directly? How would they do that?
Well, the best way is to go to our website, www.esrcheck, ESR for employment screening resources, and the word check, esrcheck.com. And there's all sorts of ways to communicate with our solutions specialists and our solutions team that can help guide an employer to what they need. Because every employer is different. There's no one size fits all. There's no magic website, www.shall-I-hire-this-person-or-not.com. It's individualized for each and every employer depending upon their needs and their situation. So to go to esrcheck.com, and there'll be a place to get in touch with us, and one of our folks will be happy to work with anyone who calls up and needs some advice and guidance in this area.
Yeah, well, that'd be great. And I think we even offer special pricing with our partnership with you guys. So we've got some information there on our website. But thank you so much. If something pops up, you think we missed something, or you want to do an update, don't hesitate to let me know. We'd love to have you back.
Excellent. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure all these years to work with Manage to Win. You guys do a great job. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Les.